What's going on, kids? It's Dr. Remy LeBeau, and I'm coming at you once again from the X-Lair to provide you my deep and insightful reaction to the latest episode of Legion. Legion Season 2 premiere tonight. We got an hour and a half of some of the most beautiful television ever produced. The fact that it is an X-Men show on top of being like this super fucking creative artistic product is better than I could have ever imagined as an X-Men fan, as a fan of filmmaking in general. Like that, this show marries like my two loves, you know, like filmmaking and X-Men in one wonderful package. As was the case when this show first aired, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what we were going to get. When I first heard that they were going to make two X-Men shows, I was like, they're going to do some horrible job and we're going to get some crappy ass television and they're going to ruin the X-Men characters. Like, that was my initial response. Then the first episode aired of this and it was fucking weird. And I sort of understood where they were going, but it took a while for the show to get going, right? And I just rewatched the entire first season. I binge watched it over the course of a few nights, and it's very clear what they were doing now. And just watching it all together, it is a work of art. It is a work of art. I kept mentioning this when I was doing my reviews for The Gifted, because The Gifted is a really excellent X-Men show, but it is nowhere near the work of art that Legion is. Like Noah Hawley, the guy, like the showrunner, the guy that sort of conceptualized this whole thing, and like everybody that he's working with are clearly artists of the highest degree. Every detail is important to them. Every shot has to be interesting. Every sequence has to be something that potentially we've never seen before, or at the very least feel like unlike anything else that's being shown right now. And together they have created like this amazing telling of a perfect story surrounding the Shadow King. The Shadow King has always been this really intimidating threat in the X-Men universe. And the only reason why he was always sort of put in his place was because you had Professor X, right? Professor X, who was able to take him down. He had the superior intellect, the superior psionic powers, the telepathy, the magnitude of his powers. It was enough to always kind of keep the Shadow King at bay. And even when that wasn't the case, like in the X-Men cartoon, when you had that one episode with Storm, where she was being taken over by the Shadow King in Africa, and then ultimately he was driven back into his astral plane prison. Like, there was always sort of this easy way out from this, like, really potentially like world-destroying, powerful, villainous mutant. And so it always kind of felt like they were kind of diminutizing the threat of the Shadow King. This show is brilliant in that it took the Shadow King and said, you know what? This is not a one-off villain. This is not something that we can just easily kind of like wrap up in a season. Like, this is a threat that potentially cannot be stopped. And the more it spreads, the greater the destruction he could potentially cause, and just the bigger the threat ultimately becomes, and the more intimidating it becomes. That is the way the Shadow King should be represented, and clearly, like, that was the driving force behind the show. It's like, we have this threat, the Shadow King, and that is going to be the basis of everything that goes on in our show. We're not going to have Xavier because that's maybe not within their grasp. Like, maybe for them, they weren't able to use Xavier because he's being used in the films. And, you know, usually when things are being used in television shows, they're not being used in films, and vice versa. That's just kind of how things generally work, but that may change. We may see Xavier in the show. I don't know. It definitely won't be Patrick Stewart. It won't be what's his name, the other guy that plays the younger version. Anyway, McAvoy, James McAvoy. It won't be him. It'll probably be somebody else completely. In the end, I don't care if they have him or not. But you have his son in there. Obviously, his son is the center of the show. He's the one that drives the narrative. But ultimately, it is the Shadow King that the show is about. Like, the threat of the Shadow King is the threat that is driving the narrative. David is sort of a way to balance that and kind of also kind of put us in a more sort of human subject position for the storytelling, so that we are seeing the story in a way through his eyes, or at least kind of following him as sort of a guide through this tale that's being told. But in the end, like, what the story is actually about is just like the threat of the Shadow King. And that is so fucking brilliant. And the fact that you're going to have David Haller, Xavier's son, in there as, again, like this sort of subject position character for us, the audience, to kind of go along for the ride with. And for him to be so powerful as well, and for him to have psychic abilities and all sorts of other abilities, clearly. Like, he can transmutate matter. Like, he can do all sorts of things. And I think the extent of his powers has yet to be sort of fully revealed and explored within the show. But having him interacting with this threat, the first season being about us kind of discovering, oh shit, the Shadow King is real. The Shadow King lives inside of David. He's been living inside of David since he was a kid. David's not crazy. David's actually super powerful, and he's been manipulated, that whole thing. And then culminating with like that final battle that finally got David out, and then ultimately having the Shadow King jump to another body and then escape. The thing that sort of that made the show as special as it is the fact that a lot of that had to take place on the astral plane, right? So a lot of the show takes place on the astral plane, both in season 1, and clearly that's going to be the case in season 2. When you're on the astral plane, you're essentially in a dreamlike reality, right? When you're in a dreamlike reality, the rules of reality go out the window. You can do whatever the fuck you want. And so that's what they've fucking been doing as filmmakers, as the creative forces outside of the show. They are saying, you know what? We can do whatever the fuck we want, because we're going to be spending a lot of time in the astral plane, in this like mentally projected reality that has no parallel rules to physical reality. It has its own rules. And those rules can be redefined constantly. They can constantly be in flux. And the way that you can go about representing that is unlimited. And you know, they've done so many different things. Like they did like that musical number in like one of the first episodes. And I was thinking today, before I started watching the show, I was like, I remember like, because it felt a slightly more grounded than the first episode at first, from the first season. And then they did have like a dance number once again, like a synchronized dance number that was this beautiful like modern dance battle between the Shadow King and David that I just fucking fell in love with. Like, that whole sequence is just spectacular, man. Like, everything on this show is everything that I love about basically most things. Like, fucking weird, off kilter, but like at the center, like fucking comic related, you know, like just fucking built from that foundation of Marvel Comics, X-Men storytelling, Bill Sienkiewicz, Chris Claremont, developing fucking Legion. I don't know who came up with the Shadow King, but nonetheless, like, having them be the center of the show is brilliant. Anyway, that's my fucking unrelenting sort of expression of how I feel about the show in general. It's fucking awesome. I mean, just watching like the first season again, and then watching one of my favorite things in that first season, even though there's a lot that was fucking awesome in that first season, but one of my favorite scenes was that sequence in David's mind. I think it was the second or the third to last episode of the season, when the story is told about his father battling the Shadow King and his father like defeating the Shadow King, and then the Shadow King entering David as sort of a way to kind of enact revenge against his father, and how it was represented on the chalkboard in like this really kind of crude animation. It was so good. It was so good. Like, it was just everything that I wanted it to be. Like, just it's again, superhero storytelling. Visually, it's really interesting, but then you also have kind of like this strange animation intertwined with reality that you can do on the astral plane, because you can do anything on the astral plane. It was fucking wonderful. I loved it, and it's just another example of how fucking awesome the creative trajectory is for this show and the things that they have done, and it bodes really well for what we're going to get. And certainly this episode did a lot to kind of reinvigorate the excitement for the show, reinvigorate the faith that I, as an audience member, and probably a lot of you have, in the show's ability to maintain what they started in the first season. And I would argue that what we saw in this episode was actually an escalating of the quality of what they started doing in the first episode, because in the first season, because in the first season they didn't know what they were going to, what like kind of impact they were going to have. They didn't know if the audience was going to find it. They didn't know if people were going to like it. Now they do. They know that there are people that love this show, and that is going to lead us to having a lot more of this show, fortunately. And given that, I'm sure that they upped the budget and they were able to sort of expand on what they were able to do within the show. Clearly the production design has expanded. They have a lot more sets now. And it's always interesting. Everything we're seeing is interesting. Just from a design perspective, a lot of sort of modern representations of normal everyday shit, but just really kind of like playing with colors and shapes in the designs that echo the sort of weirdness of the world that David lives in. That is not necessarily not our world, but one that, because it's infused with the potential for, falling into this sort of astral plane reality where all the rules go out the window. Because of that, like, it feels otherworldly, and the fact that the production design kind of echoes that is just a way to kind of reinforce that aspect of it, that at any point you don't know what could be happening. You don't know if we're in actual reality or if we're in the astral plane. We could be in both at the same time. I don't know. It's like, we don't know. I gotta stop hitting this. It's just everything about this show is so good. It's just, as I was watching, I was like, it was like this sense of like mental relief of like, yes, this is what I want. Like, this is what I fucking want. If you're not going to give me a pure ass fucking X-Men cartoon that's going to be fucking perfect and it's going to represent my characters exactly as I want them represented and tell the stories in the way that I want them represented, and you're not going to make movies that exactly follow the comics in the way that I expect you to, if you're going to make a television show, then it better be what I'm watching with Legion. And I'm so happy to be getting that. Anyway, that's me not talking about the actual episode yet, just me kind of gushing over the show and like everything I like about it. And I know I've gone a bunch of different directions, but that's what the show inspires in me as an audience member, as a viewer. And it makes me really happy. It makes me really happy that it exists and that we're getting more of it. This is the whole second season. I don't know how many episodes there's going to be in this season. We only got 8 episodes the first season. Just bought it on Blu-ray. Came out a couple of days ago. Like I said, I binged it just the last few nights, actually. And now we're getting more of it. And I cannot wait to find out what's going to happen. So as far as the actual stuff that went on in the show. So at the end of, and this was a post-credit scene at the end of the season finale of season 1. David was like teleported into this weird orb, taken away. It was implied here that that Sydney, that other mutant, we don't know her actual mutant name. We don't know if she has a foundation in X-Men canon in the comics. Maybe she does. If she does, make sure to let me know in the comments, because I'm not sure about it. But we know that she's a mutant. We know that potentially she was communicating with him from the future and wants him to help the Shadow King find his body. So we found out that this seems to be sort of like what this season is about. This season is going to be about the Shadow King searching for his body, because once he gets his body, he'll become more powerful, based on what we heard. And now David's being told by Sydney in the future that he needs to help Al-Farouq find his body, which is interesting. And maybe that's what that whole orb experience was about. But it's not exactly clear, because again, some of the things that we see, we don't exactly understand with respect to like the nature of the reality. Is it real? Is it not? Did it happen? Did it not? Is he imagining it? Maybe not. There was that whole weird kind of poetic exploration visually and in words of a delusion. And it was really interesting. It was a really interesting sort of thing to talk about and explore. And the way that it was talked about and explored was so fucking abstract. And like, it was like a pure fucking work of art, man. Like, really? An X-Men show this artistic? Yes, please. Fucking yes. So anyway, we saw that delusion, that sort of weird, like, strange creature that represented a delusion crawling under David's bed towards the end when him and Sid had sex in the astral plane, implying that he has deluded himself into believing that what had happened didn't happen, and the time spent in that orb was just a few hours or whatever. And so we don't really know what's going on with David ultimately, because of what we saw with that delusion, that whole delusional thing that was heavily emphasized, obviously, and super important. So we don't know if the Shadow King still has some sort of residual hold on him. There's a lot we don't understand, and I don't want to understand. I want to wait to see what's going to happen on the show and like the direction it's going to take us. I'm really excited about it because it was so interesting to just kind of go through this episode and watch the story kind of unfold in the most interesting way possible, leading us in directions that were unexpected and still uncertain. And it's just like, I can't really find the words to express how much I fucking love what I just saw and how much I love this show. I can't express it enough. I can like make out with it, but that'd be kind of weird. And I don't want to make out with a Blu-ray. I'm just saying that's kind of beyond beyond the limits of reason. But this show is kind of making me go there. You know what I mean? Because that's what this show's about. It's about fucking taking you away from what you know to be convention and fucking throwing all the rules of conventional storytelling, conventional representation of reality out the window, and then, you know, basically giving us candy for the brain, which is what this show felt like. It felt like just candy for the brain. And it has a very David Lynchian kind of quality. So if you haven't seen it, the Twin Peaks revival series that David Lynch directed, he directed like all the episodes. I forget how many episodes there were, but I think there were like, how many were there? There were 18 episodes. 18 fucking episodes. He directed all of them himself. It was super fucking weird. It's the kind of shit that I fucking love, but there was a finesse that it was missing. Like, David Lynch is a filmmaker. He has always made films on his own, and maybe with studios, but really with complete autonomy, not huge budgets. And it'd been a while since he'd made a film, and it'd been a while, and I think he kind of lost grasp of all the tools that you can use to really create this seamless reality now versus then. Like some of the special effects were kind of wonky, even though it was all really super interesting to watch. Legion pulls all of it off seamlessly. Like the special effects, the kind of weird stuff that we see juxtaposed against like normalcy, all together winds up just being executed seamlessly, perfectly, in a way that it doesn't feel cheap. It feels like of the highest quality, and therefore you're not taken out of it at any point. You're just kind of you go along for the ride, and you stay in that ride until the end, and then when you're done, you take some sort of antipsychotic to kind of bring you back down to reality. But that's a whole other thing that has to happen after you watch an episode of Legion. Anyway, I'm digressing a lot. So we found ourselves at the beginning of the show, a year after the end of the last season, and the group that was his team essentially of mutants is now working for Division 3. That burned guy is in there. They've somehow gotten to some weird point of like being able to work together because they understand that there's a greater threat, the Shadow King. This Division 3 is fucking weird as fuck. That leader of Division 3, that guy with the hornet's nest over his head, the bee net, whatever it is, weird kind of hive over his head that speaks through these three sort of androgynous, mustached people, but they said something about computers being put into brains. I don't know, but there's three of them, and they seem to they have like a hive mind, and maybe they're being controlled by the center. Anyway, like that itself, like that didn't need to happen. You know, like you could have just had some guy be the head of the organization, but Noah Hawley and everybody else was like, no, we gotta have some fucking weird ass shit to simply represent the leader of this District 3 or whatever it's called. And they did, and they pulled it off incredibly. Like just that whole scene with like David talking to him, and like they're in that room, and like the three robot human entity talking hive mind creature people were behind those kind of like weird magnifying discs that amplified like their heads, the size of their heads, and then you had like these weird lights like hanging from the ceiling, and then you had this. It was like a shot of trees, like a shot of forest, but like from the bottom up. Like if you're standing in the bottom of a forest and you're looking up, it was a shot of that, but it was projected behind him. And then behind David was this shot of like a staircase that seemed to be pretty never ending to some extent, or pretty relatively long. And it was also that shot of like, if you were at the bottom of it looking up, then that's what you would see, and that was projected behind him. And I mean, just from a design standpoint, like that whole sequence, outside of the story, outside of the characters, just looking at all that shit was so fucking beautiful and interesting to fucking take in. But on top of the fact that it looks like that, you've got a great fucking story kind of unfolding. David figuring out shit, being told about Al-Farouq, being told about the fact that the body of Al-Farouq is what everybody's going after, and like, and the way that conversation went down with these kind of weird fucking triumvirate of fucking human machine, whatever. Who knows? Obviously, there's a mutation involved somewhere there. Like, it's not just weird for the sake of it. Like, if something is weird on the show, it's a result of mutation in some way, shape, or form. I'm sure we'll find out more about this guy later. I'm, again, one that believes that if you're going to represent characters from one medium and another medium, that you should try to be as loyal as possible to that canon by having characters within that canon be represented in the other medium. So if we're talking about X-Men, I want to see my X-Men characters in that world represented in the show. And clearly they've come up with a lot of their own characters. And normally I would hate that. But I like the what's happening here, like the creative forces behind this show, they in some way like mirror the creative forces behind Grant Morrison. The things that drive him. So Grant Morrison came into X-Men after Chris Claremont, came up with Secondary Mutations, came up with Cassandra Nova, came up with the destruction of Genosha. Did so much. Came up with new characters, the Cuckoos, the fucking Quentin Quire. Like, brought so much to the table, something that has not happened since. There's been a few things that sort of push forward like the story canon in the comics, but Grant Morrison was like the last big sort of driving creative force. And when I read that run that Grant Morrison did, even though a lot of it felt foreign to me, it was really exciting, and I was willing to go along for the ride into this like new world of the X-Men with slightly different rules. That's the way I feel about this show. Like, take me anywhere you want, Legion. Come up with anything you want, because I'm all in on it. Like, you know what you're doing. You know how to create this world in the most interesting way possible. You want to have some weird fucking head of an organization that communicates to 3 fucking weird androgynous midgets. So fucking be it. Midgets. Not midgets. Twins. Siamese twins, essentially. If you want to have that, fucking yes! That adds to it. It adds to everything that's fucking wonderful about the show. Anyway, I'm going to stop gushing about this stuff because I could go on forever on this. Like, it's so fucking good. The quality is incredible. The creativeness of everything that's seen and the thing that makes it so wonderful is the story. Like, there's still a great story being told. Like, the Shadow King, the threat. Now that he's out of David, like, he's spreading. And he's, like, fucking infecting people's minds and fucking them up and, like, leaving a fucking trail of these, like, zombies in his wake. And it's exactly what I would think would happen if the Shadow King were to get loose without having any sort of adversary to take him down. Like, he would be fucking rampaging through this world and leaving destruction of minds in his wake, and that is what we're seeing. And I think it's fucking wonderful. I love this guy that's playing Oliver. I think he's such an interesting person. Like, even the casting on the show is wonderful. I think the whole notion of, like, Oliver having been in this weird kind of coma for 20 years, this chick Melanie, his wife, played by Jean Smart, who used to be on Designing Women, and apparently I think on Fargo. I haven't watched Fargo yet. I'm gonna have to watch it at some point because the same dude, Noah Hawley, is behind that shit. She is a mutant, and clearly in the first season she wanted David to help her get her husband back, who's also a telepath, a psychic, has similar powers to David. That's what was told in the first season. And when he finally does get him back, the Shadow King fucking takes him away, and he's gone for another year now. So she, who's been wanting to get her husband back, finally gets him back for a split second and loses him again. So now you've got her fucking all fucked up because of it. It's been a year of that. And we see it on the show. We see the toll that it's taken on her, and it's just so authentic and wonderful, and such another interesting element of the show. Then you've got that other dude that can go into people's memories. You've got that one dude that can split and become that girl and who lives inside of him. There's just so many interesting elements in the show, and it's just the best fodder for all sorts of wonderful, interesting stories to be told. But the fact that the focus is on David and the Shadow King, and that there's an importance placed on it, above all else, above all these other really interesting elements. And beyond that, like, everything that's represented is represented so artistically and so creatively, just makes it the perfect fucking show. I can't, obviously, I've been talking way too much positively about the show for half an hour now, and I could keep going. And bottom line is, like, we are very lucky to be living today when a show like this can exist. And not only can it exist, but you can have a first season, you can have a second season, and you can maybe have even more. And it makes up for a lot of the crap that we have to deal with the X-Men films, like being hit and miss, mainly miss. And it bodes really well for, like, what can happen moving forward when you get some really wonderful creative forces behind this amazing content that all of us love so much. If you're watching this, clearly you love the X-Men as much as I do. Or maybe slightly less. You know, I do tend to like it quite a bit. Anyway, that's the end of my sort of gush session for this second second season premiere of Legion season 2. I'll do a little bit of a review every week as the episodes air. I think we're in for a real fucking huge treat this season. Even though last season we were as well, I just didn't know it at the beginning. I didn't know it. In fact, so much so that, like, I watched the first episode, and then it took me like 3 episodes before I went back and watched the 3 episodes back to back, realized what was happening, and then I was all in. And then, you know, those last 4 episodes were just fucking so exciting to me. But I was still a little bit, you know, pessimistic about the whole experience, thinking that it would ultimately let me down, and it did not. And so now that I'm all in on it, I'm ready to talk about it as it's happening. So hopefully you'll be along for the ride. If you haven't already done so, there's a little button down there, subscribe, click on that, keep up with my reviews. Certainly, I'm a big X-Men fan. Certainly, I'll be talking about as much of the relationship the show has to the X-Men world as I can. But also, I have a degree in film, even though I'm an economist now and I teach economics at a university. I have a deep-seated love for filmmaking, and the kind of filmmaking that we're seeing in this show is just so exquisite that I'm going to be gushing over that as well. So if you're in, be coming back. I'll be sharing my enthusiasm with you, and feel free to share your enthusiasm with me in the comments below. And like the video if you like it. Don't like it if you don't like it. Give it a thumbs down. Whatever you choose. I'm not for everybody. Not everything is for everybody. This show is not for everybody. But I have a feeling that a lot of you out there that have been with me for several years, I think this is a show for you, and I think we're in for a real fucking treat with the rest of the season. I can't wait to share my thoughts on it. Anyway, that's it for now, folks. I will see you next week. As always, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, you better put an X in that box, because ain't nobody checking me. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.